Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically um, show you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to chop out all this bit of code, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the start of where you would normally start within Python. So you normally start with, if you ignore these lines below, you always start with this line here. So we've got, as you can see on the left hand side, we've got main.py. So main.py is where every program in Python has a main, where it starts like this, where you say whatever you're going to put underneath this is the code it's going to run basically. So what we're going to do, we're going to cover functions, which are basically reusable bits of code. So what I've got at the moment is if I paste that stuff back in, so I've got a function called print hi, and at the moment what I'm going to do is this function name here, print hi, can be called anything. I could call that wash up dishes, I could call that anything I wanted to basically. And when I call that function, I'm going to pass in, I can either pass in parameters into it or I can not pass parameters into it. And the idea is that those parameters are then going to be used by that function to do something. So in our case, what we're going to do is we're going to basically pass in a name, and we're going to pass in a number. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into this print hi. So when you define a function, this is how you ignore these for now, these things. But what we've got is we've got this function, and we call the function with, we say use this word def, which is defining the function. We're going to define it with a name, so that could print hi, wash up dishes, or do whatever. And we're going to pass in some variables. So the idea is when we pass in variables, we've got these are variable names, and these are the parameters that this function is going to take. So we're going to take a name in, and we're going to take a number of times that someone, whoever this is here, washes up the dishes. And then what we're going to do is we're going to print the name out. So if I could do within the print statement, it always has to have brackets, and I could print a name there just like that, and that'll work absolutely fine. So when we call this function, what we're doing is we're calling it down here, and we're passing in Arion, and we're passing number 1. So we know that Arion's washed up the dishes once. And then we're going to call that same function again, and we're going to take Alice's name, and we're going to print the fact that she washed up the dishes 5 times. So if we go back up here, so these are parameters that are getting passed in. So when we call this function, we're calling this function, and we're Arion and the value 1 get put into these values here. So Arion goes into there, and the number 1 goes into this wash up dishes variable. So these are variables. They're parameters, but also called variables. And then we're printing the variable out. So we're printing the name out here, and we might print the number of times that someone washed up the dishes. So now the thing is that the print statement, we can put in wash up dishes here, but if we mix, so these 2 lines will work perfectly alright. We can print the name, and we can print washing up dishes. And then what we're going to do is we're going to comment out all the other lines of code that I put in for showing you some other things before. So I'm going to comment all these lines. So we can use a hash in front of these lines, and what that'll do is basically it'll make it so these lines don't get executed. So we're going to print hi, we're going to call that function, we're going to call it a reusable bit of code it is, and we're going to call it twice. We're going to call it with Arion and 1 and Alice and 5, and you'll see those 2 values come out. Now when we got this third line, this print here, we can actually mix the number, and so we can put some text in here. So we can say, if you imagine that name coming in, it could be Arion, and then it would say has washed up the dishes. So we use this plus here to put together bits of strings. So we've got a string, which is the word Arion, and then we've got a string which is has washed up the dishes, and then we've got another string which is the value of that has washed up the dishes, what we have to do, we have to use this str thing here, and what that does is it will just take that wash up dishes, which is a number, and it will convert it into a string. And that's because when we print strings out, they always have to be together with other strings when we use them on the same line. We can do these two lines, we can print the number there, and that's fine, but once we mix it with other strings, we need to basically use this str. That's just a little thing that you need to remember in Python. Don't worry about that for now though. So what we'll expect to do is we'll expect to see the name. So Arion has washed up the dishes 5 or 1, however many times. Alright, so that's what we expect to happen. So at the moment, these bits of code here, I'm going to comment these out because these aren't actually being called anyway. So just don't want you to get confused because we're going to use them later. So what we're going to do is we're going to see Arion and Alice, and this is a reusable function. So this is getting called twice. So if I run that, you can see that Arion is getting printed, the number of times that he's washed up, and then we get the full string. Arion has washed up the dishes 1 times. Then we get Alice coming out, the number 5, because he's washed up 5 times, and Alice has washed up the dishes 5 times. And that's because this function is getting called twice, and it's getting called with those values that we're passing in. So these are parameters, and when they come in, they're parameters here, but they're variables. They're called variables because a variable can have a value put in it, and it's a bit like a bit of memory where it just remembers what thing is. You just name it, and then you can use it later on. So I could define a variable, and then I can use it. And the way to define variables, I could say here, for instance, x equals 2. So that's just assigning a variable, which is at 2, to this thing x. And then if I print the value x, print, don't forget we need to have brackets, and I can just put a value x in there. If I wanted to say x equals something, I could say, it's easier to do, x is, and then I could say plus, and then don't forget we have to put this str in if we're going to do that. So we could print x in 2 ways. We could print it with and without a string. So printing it without a string, we don't have to use a str, but printing it with a string, like this x is, then we do have to use a str. So that's the difference, where you have to use str and where you don't have to use str. And then I can run that. So x is 2, so you can see x is 2, it's printing it out there. I can put a space in there as well, and it will just format it a bit better. So you can see now the function's getting called, the values are being passed in parameters, and they're being printed out. These are variables. So all you have to remember is the print hi is a function that's getting called a couple of times. Okay, that's simple as that. Okay.